I got a cool hat to cover up my balding head. Welcome to a winding political rant. Um, I don't know what's going on. I've been trying to go. I've been thinking. I was reading. Here's what happened. I decided to try and read some books, and those books made me do thinking. And then I've been thinking for like the past 4 days, and the full story. I started reading a book called The Art of Not Being Governed by George C. Scott. James C. Scott? James C. Scott, I think is his name. Um, about Zomia. I'm not going to give you a whole rundown of the book, but it's effectively it's a sort of anthropological um, study of the the history of peoples in this region of Southeast Asia called Zomia, and how they've historically evaded the state. Uh, which also made me think back to James C. Scott's previous book that I'd read part of, which is called Seeing Like a State, which is one of those books that I think is both amazing and terrible, in that the ideas in it are amazing, but the book is so ridiculously dry and academic that it is a slog to read, um, which is why I never finished it. But those two books in tandem got me thinking a lot about. Now, he's not he's famously he's not an anarchist, but he's like constantly writes from the perspective of an anarchist and says like, I'm not an anarchist, but I like to look at the world through an anarchist bent, which I think is kind of a meaningless statement, but it got me thinking about a lot of stuff. And then reading up on Zomia some more, because I was interested. The book mainly focuses on the history of Zomia for the past 2,000 years, basically up to World War II. And in the preface, Scott says that like most of this isn't relevant after World War II, and definitely not after the 1960s. So I was curious after reading the book, which I didn't finish also, but I tend to do this where I don't finish books. Um, what was going on in that region after that. So I read some other anthropological studies. Um, I've become very invested in Myanmar. I've read up on the food of Southeast Asia quite a lot. Um, I don't know. That's sort of been a current that's been happening in my life. But then, yeah, reading a lot of these books and reading about the politics of the region today, it's got me thinking about anarchism. Because I'm an anarchist, right? At least sort of. I consider myself to be some sort of anarchist. Um, and the thing is, I've been an anarchist for a very long time. I've been an anarchist probably since I was about 16. But if I could talk to my 16-year-old self right now, I would consider him to be an idiot, right? I was an anarchist back then because I thought it sounded cool. I sort of stumbled onto, like, what's the chances that I just stumbled into the correct political ideology? It seems pretty odd. But everyone else I know, that's not true. I don't know why I said it like that. A lot of other people I know have gone through these very, like, ideological um, shifts where they jump from ideology to ideology, especially in their teenage years. Like I know people who have gone from like liberal to Maoist to fucking libertarian to like playing with right wing fascist ideas to like social democrat, like that sort of thing. Um, I know, and like a lot of people I know online have gone through these sorts of big political jumps. And, parts of my politics also have done that over the years. Mainly because I used to be an idiot when I was a teenager and I hadn't really read any books. But, like, really, I've been an anarchist the whole time. I've been various varieties of anarchist, but I've basically been an anarchist the whole time. And so much of my politics, especially when I was younger, was just so based on, like, what I thought was cool rather than, like, facts. Like, I, for a time, was very interested in anarcho-nihilism because it sounds very cool to me. Listen, I'm the sort of guy that likes Shadow the Hedgehog unironically. Okay, I like that sort of thing. I like the cool, edgy stuff. And so I would read Blessed is the Flame and things. But whatever. Um, there's this text from a group called Crime Think. Um, and they have a text called Your Politics is Boring as Fuck. I was kind of that guy. A proud lifestylist. Um, but and then there was a good time when I got very interested in, just like everyone else on the internet, very interested in Nick Land and accelerationism. Uh, but over time, my ideology has kind of hardened and solidified into a basic um, general principle of like what I suppose you could call anti-humanism or post-humanism. Uh, and the thing is that the more that I've gone into that, the more I've actually gone back to Marx. Like, you're looking for a post-humanist analysis of capital. That's Karl fucking Marx, you know? Like at this point, I've got to like I feel like I have no choice but to just reread Capital. Anyway, but then very recently, like after reading this James C. Scott stuff, the, the other thing is that at some point I read Desert, and then at like various other points, I'm also like just in another part of my life very interested in Linux and computer stuff like that, which kind of pushed me towards not an anprim, but a very ecological um, side of anarchism, uh, where like for example, one of my blog posts, I like argue in favor of basically subsistence agriculture as like the predominant mode of human existence. Which now I look back on it, I'm not. I don't know what I mean. My argument in those sorts of situations was basically and continues to be basically not this is good necessarily, but like uh, once the climate collapses and the topsoil doesn't work anymore, this is all we're going to be able to do. Which is still something that I mean, I can't disagree with myself on that. I think ecological issues are maybe the most pressing issues that we face. But at the same time, it's very hard to, there's the real, I'm not sure. Basically, recently I've just been thinking about how if when you go on the internet and you say you're an anarchist, you're kind of a laughing stock, right? People believe that you're like 16 and have never read a book before, which was the case at some point for me, but is no longer the case, right? Like, no one thinks anarchism is like a legitimate political ideology. Like, other leftists tend to sort of see you as a joke, um, and the historical record is not nice to you in the sense that, like, if you're a fucking tanky, right? The criticism of you based on like historical examples is gonna be like your ideology produces genocide. Like, look how many people suffered and died under Stalin. Look how many people suffered and died under Mao, etc. Right? And then you can get into all sorts of arguments about how the statistics were made up by the CIA or whatever, um, or how Kulaks deserved it. But like the attitude people really give you is one of like kind of fear, right? Like legit, in my opinion, legitimate fear, right? Like if Stalinists took over, that would be really bad, in my opinion. You don't want Stalinists to take over. Uh, and the same is true of like leftists when it comes to liberals. They have the same basic critiques. Like, look how many people have died. Uh, look at the when your group was in power, etc. This is pretty much the case for everyone except for anarchists, because instead the critique of anarchists, examples of anarchism that are popular in the Western canon are it's Catalonia, um, which is just pathetic. Like, Catalonia is too, like, as much as there were some admirable things about Catalonia, it's just shit, right? It lasted 3 years. Um, it they had like prisons. It's like so obviously a failed experiment. Like, you can't just you know what I mean. And Magnovia, same thing. I think that's how you pronounce that. Magnovichnia. I don't know. The Nesta Magno one, same situation. Lasted like 3 years. Barely got anything done. Collapsed. Right. And those are the historical examples. Those are the people that have read the same books as you. Those are the guys that have read God and the State and the Conquest of Bread. Um, and those are your Soviet era examples that everyone else wants to talk about, but your ones just fucking suck. And it's just you're just kind of a. It's not like Stalinism where people are like, oh, look how dangerous this ideology is. People, it's just unserious. It's just like you couldn't even do anything. It's just a joke, right? Um, and the same is the case for and they'll find some way to turn even the more legitimate anarchist projects or self-governing projects into a joke, like Rojava. Um, you know, I think Rojava has been a great success, and anyone who uh, denies that is an idiot. Like, if you tell that to the women in the region, I mean, come on. Obviously, they're not without that. No perfect society exists. They've had their problems. They continue to have their problems. But just saying that at one point they were funded by the Americans is not like a proper counter argument. And I have some critiques of the way Rojava is organized and whatever, but I think anyone who wants to just shit on them for no reason is an idiot. But no one takes you seriously, really. And then there's the Zapatistas, which is a similar kind of situation where people just sort of no one, even though by all accounts they are like successful as a not necessarily anarchist, but I would call them self-governing, certainly left libertarian. Um, people just don't really take you seriously. It's very odd. I don't really understand what's going on, and it's not just tankies. It's like anyone on the anyone who the sort of people who will tell you read on authority even though they haven't read on authority. It's those sorts of people. Um, but it's also liberals as well, which actually, funny enough, the Leninists are also liberals. They just don't realize it. Uh, it's kind of embarrassing to be an anarchist, is basically what I'm saying. Unfortunately for me, every time I try and stop being an anarchist, I just keep being like, well, hold on, I think these guys are right. I think the anarchists were right. Not all of them, you know, but we have a couple of advantages um, over the orthodox Marxists, which is like anarchists. I mean, the fundamental anarchist critique is that capital and the state are inseparable. You can't abolish one without. You can't successfully abolish the what's the word here? Domination of one without abolishing the domination of the other. Uh, you know, and you can actually find for a long time it was kind of theoretical, and then along came David Graeber with Debt the First 5,000 Years to be like, here's the historical evidence that we're right. Uh, but then there's the goddamn problem where I don't, where I'm left isolated. Is that fucking I hate David Graeber. I hate his politics. Like, I think his books are great. I love Debt the First 5,000 Years. I love A New History of Humanity, the Dawn of Everything. I love Bullshit Jobs. Not as a concept. I like the book. Um, Graeber is undeniably great as a writer. Unfortunately, his politics are the exact opposite of everything I believe. Obviously, he is an anarchist. Maybe the exact opposite would be to be a fascist, but he is such a humanist to the degree of like discarding material analysis that it's just insane. He's most well known for the quote, I believe the quote is, "The truth of the world is that it is what we make it." Which, if you were to ask me to say the opposite of what I believe, it would be that. Like, I don't think Graeber's historical analysis supports his claim at all. I don't think any historical analysis supports this humanist claim. And especially for leftists coming from a tradition of Marx, they should know this, right? Like, I think, you know, unfortunately, humanist interpretation of Marx is like what's most popular on the internet right now because most people are unquestioningly humanists. Um, and like, there's actually, this might be a bit of a hot take, but I think that the end result of humanist Marxism is that's the Khmer Rouge. Like, that's the communist that no one likes, you know? Like, there's not even a small group of people defending, or the fucking Burmese Road to Socialism, Burmese Way to Socialism. I don't even remember what the party was called. But those guys, they, the Pol Pot type, that is like undeniably humanist communism. It is the worst failed ideology in history, and that's what I see. And maybe if you don't know what I mean by humanist, like you might think I'm talking about something else. What I mean is sort of the idea that human agents are the central drivers of history. Um, which is, yeah, I don't agree with, and I don't think Marx agrees with, at least by later on, not when he was really young, uh, either. Uh, that like there are all sorts of systems um, which we live in that determine the path of history, not the wills of the people. Um, and I think that this is another thing that made me pretty jaded about left wing politics is that on the surface, you know, the analysis of capital or capitalism is based on this historical materialist perspective that I just outlined, right? That there are these systems, and those systems have consequences, and by analyzing those systems, right, that sort of thing. Um, but then the solution has always been the opposite. The solution has always been that's proposed is like mass popular uprising. This idea, this very humanist Rousseau, I don't know if it's necessarily Rousseau, uh, whatever, insert Enlightenment philosopher here, um, idea that, like, well, the people will rise up and demand change, and that's how change happens. Whether that's, the workers or whatever, which probably seemed a lot more realistic when you were closer in time to the liberal revolution, but to me, doesn't reflect reality, especially because of advances in technology. Hey, we're bringing it back. We're bringing it back to James C. Scott, because the reason why the art of not being governed is not relevant anymore is basically because of technological developments following the Second World War, particularly roads and helicopters. That, like previously, these people were able to live anarchistically. They're not anarchists, but they live without a state because they lived up high in the inaccessible mountains and jungles, where the state couldn't reach them. It was just impractical. But with the building of all-weather roads, and also in this area in Southeast Asia, for half the year it's the rainy season, and these, it would just be mud. It's just like you can't get there. But with all-weather roads and helicopters, now you can. Um, and I think that this sort of the modern state surveillance technology and military technology um, really negate a lot of these ideas about popular uprisings being the driver of change. Um, and so, really, yeah, this is the thing that's made me sort of disenfranchised is the question of, well, what ought we to do about all this? You can sit there analyzing things forever, but what ought we to do? And it's very unsatisfying for the answer to be we can't do anything. Um, Although I still kind of believe that to be the case. But I wanted to go back and really try and fundamentally understand, like, capitalism and why do we want to get rid of this thing in the first place? Because you get lost in the source. At a certain point, I've been reading a lot of like postmodern um, Deleuze and Guattari and Baudrillard and Foucault and post-anarchist stuff, post-left anarchist stuff, you know, all of these sorts of things. And I've sort of had lost sight of these fundamental Marxist critiques of capitalism that are really like it's an extreme. I hate it when people do this. I hate it when leftists do this. But I'm a bust out the word that I hate that I hate it when leftists use, and I've never done this before. But scientific, like the critiques of capitalism that are undeniable and data driven, not theoretical and not philosophical, but like I actually wrote a bunch of them down because I wanted to just get it in my head. So like for a big one would be like so land is a natural monopoly because land is permanent and irreplaceable. Anyone who owns land has a monopoly over that land. Um, and capitalism is not very good at dealing with monopolies. It's like the whole thing about capitalism is it's supposed to work through competition. And so capitalism is always going to be bad at distributing housing. Uh, I think it's a really obvious example of a way in which capitalism fails, and a very fundamental one. And then another fundamental flaw in capitalism uh, is this kind of tendency towards rent seeking, uh, which exists, I think, primarily in two planes uh, as we see them now. Like this is I'm trying to critique from my perspective in 2024, which is uh, planned obsolescence and as a service. Uh, so planned obsolescence is a fundamental problem of capitalism that is really easy to point out. Like if a economic system is incentivizing the production of worse goods that break more easily because repeat business is always preferable to one-off businesses or one-off sales. And secondly, a sort of downstream effect of that is even though there are people who may compete with companies that sell um, poor quality goods that break easily, um, those competitors have to charge more for the longer lasting high quality goods because they don't get the repeat business of the goods that are going to go obsolete soon. Um, and because of that, it means that and specifically because of the way people earn money in capitalism via wages, it means that the poor are the ones who have to spend the most money because they can only afford the lower quality goods that are going to break more easily. They can't afford to pay the higher upfront costs, even if over a long term they would save money simply because they don't earn enough through wages to do so, because wages are paid, you know how wages work. Um, and so, this problem that was already bad is actually even worse because it, like, specifically in an absurdity of calculus logic, means that the poorer people have to pay more and the richer people have to spend less money when the poor people have less money to spend. I think an excellent example of the of like absurd capitalist logic. Um, and another tendency towards rent seek, like, if you think about it, planned obsolescence is basically rent seeking, right? It's like, why continue to produce new innovations and whatever when you can just have customers continue to pay you to use the same stuff? That's effectively what planned obsolescence is. Um, Land also rent seeking. This land monopoly, I mean literally rent seeking. Um, and then the other thing is these as a service products, where again, because it's always preferable for capitalists to earn continuous repeat business, um, they're incentivized to create uh, subscription services and as a service models, um, and rent models over models of ownership. Uh, and oftentimes, the place in which this happens most is in tech monopolies, um, or oligopolies, whatever you want to call them, which I think is very relevant to the world we live in. And this, like, really, while I was thinking about this stuff, it got me thinking a lot about Yanis Varoufakis and his book Techno-Feudalism, because, you know, this does seem to be where things are heading, towards a more feudalist mode of arrangement where everything is just rent. Uh, Profit doesn't matter. And then there's obviously a bunch of other things. I think advertising is a big problem in capitalism, which again, fundamental logic of capitalism, that uh, the best goods and services will be produced because consumers will vote with their wallet, and select for superior things. Well, that goes out the window once you realize that human psychology is something that can be manipulated, and people with more money can spend more on manipulating it, which means through the form of advertising and other forms of psychological trickery, firms can, you know, generate large profits through selling inferior goods. I think there's no better example of that than Apple. Apple, like, objectively sells um, laptops, let's just say MacBooks, that have fewer ports, lower power, um, worse battery life, in many cases worse software. That might be subjective, but yeah, objective measures, right? Less I/O, worse battery life, and worse performance, um, and lower longevity for a higher price than their competitors, a significantly higher price than their competitors, because they've marketed themselves as a luxury product and a lifestyle brand, which is, has nothing to do with the actual product they're making. It's entirely construction of marketing. Uh, like, this is clearly not something like that. I think this is a pretty clear example of perverse incentive structures creating suboptimal outcomes in the market, or in a market economy. I mean, I have a whole bunch of these, and the thing is, most of these don't even mention production side. Most of these are just issues of, or it's like labor side. Most of these are just issues of what's produced. Um, like, obviously, I think maybe the central leftist critique of capitalism is the exploitative nature of the capitalist and proletariat relationships in the workplace. How it's a violation of people's liberties. How undemocratic workplaces are a violation of people's liberties. I would also extend that to Because advertising is so important in capitalism, as I just said, um, there are incentives on companies to surveil their customers as much as possible to more effectively psychologically manipulate them. And that's also a violation of people's liberties. Uh, I'm not just going to keep going. I have a list of like fucking 50 things here. But that's what I've been trying to do, is just write out as many critiques of capitalism that are fundamental. And if you want to get into solutions to some of these I think are solvable or at least addressable through regulation. Like land being a natural monopoly, you got to put your Georgist hat on there and implement a land value tax. But planned obsolescence and the selling of these inferior products, um, which prey on poor people, is something you can't really legislate against. France has tried, but it's something that's really hard to prove. Right? It's just it's you can't legislate against it. It's a fundamental problem of capitalism. Um, Same with you could theoretically ban all advertising. It would never happen. Um, and the reason it would never happen is because it would, lose so many people so much money that economies would collapse. I mean, Apple is what the second most valuable company in the world, I think, behind Microsoft, and its entire business model depends on advertising and marketing. Um, it wouldn't exist without it, and that is like most of the American economy. The U.S. empire would collapse without Apple. Um, so, these sorts of things would just never happen. Um, and obviously, you can't fix the. I mean, I suppose you could argue that you can the only reform that fixes the the tension between worker and boss um, is a reform of the way the mode of production. Stronger incentives on worker co-ops and so on. I don't know where I was going with this. Oh yeah, I kind of remember, because there's one guy that I haven't mentioned yet, who is maybe one of my favorite writers, philosophers, is Georges Bataille. I think this is really what everyone's missing. I know we're 30 minutes into this long and winding rant about bathos. Um, Bataille. It all comes back to Bataille for me, because, like, if you look at capitalism, like liberals and social democrats, they effectively have the opinion that you have the production side of things and then the distribution side of things. And the production side of things is fine. In fact, it's pretty good. But the distribution side of things is bad. It distributes things unequally. And that's the problem. We need to implement wealth taxes and so on to redistribute things more fairly. And then the Marxist, uh, the communist response to that is how production and distribution are like intrinsically linked to the mode of production, or like distribution is intrinsically linked to the mode of production. You will never solve the problem by just taxing people more. But the battalion approach, I think, is very important, which is that both these guys, you can talk about how the mode of distribution needs reform, then you can talk about how the mode of production needs reform, but you're ignoring, and all of these restricted economists have ignored, the reason why we make things in the first place. Why are we producing and distributing goods? Because of consumption. That the consumption side is really the mode of consumption is really the fundamental defining feature of an economy. What we do with excess and surplus, uh, which might just sound like an extension of this redistributive, reformist, social democracy stuff, but it's really not. It's much more interesting than that, because it's about sacrifice. It's about expenditure, willful expenditure. Um, That's not to say that these are, it's all part of one cohesive system. Uh, I feel like I was going to say something else here. I don't really remember. Um, so it's not very convincing to tell people you want to go back to the Stone Age, right? Like even if, and some part of me does believe this, you think that like industrial capitalism is fundamentally at odds with ecology. Like you cannot have even nuclear powered or renewable powered industrial capitalism in anything like its current form and not have ecological collapse, which is something that I think I believe. Um, just for the rundown on that, people don't realize it takes a lot of energy to create these alternative forms of energy, and we're not doing it fast enough. Um, but maybe even more central than that, the ecological problems that people ignore, that most propaganda surrounding ecology focuses entirely on CO2 emissions, which, don't get me wrong, are a very important issue, but I would not say they're the most important issue facing the climate. I would say resource scarcity is more important than that. Um, so, like, oil's going to run out, gas is going to run out, etc. Um, that's a more fundamental problem that just switching to renewables can't solve. You're like, wait, what do you mean? Renewables don't rely on oil and gas. But the machines that dig the renewables out of the ground and the factories that turn those raw materials into solar panels, at least right now, depend on um, non renewable resources. And those solar panels are made of non renewable resources, and the blades of wind turbines are made of non renewable resources, etc. Uh, you know, not to mention many solar panels, for example, will never produce as much energy in their lifetime as it took to produce them in the first place. Uh, so these are problems, and to address them, you need to actually address the mode of consumption. That this uh, ludicrous expenditure of energy is is just not sustainable. That people will need to live in a state like this energy wealth that we have, at least as I see it. And I think that you could convince me otherwise if you talk to me hard enough about thorium, probably. But as I see it, that I'm skeptical of. Let's just say I'm skeptical. Doesn't not say I'm convinced, but let's say I'm skeptical of the idea that we can continue like this forever, and in fact keep going longer and longer, consuming more electricity. Um, right. There was something else I was going to talk about. Fuck, this was leading to something. This was all leading to something. What was it? I've completely lost my train of thought. Right. So that's just that aspect of things. But then beyond that, there is topsoil depletion, which is a much more present issue, and people don't realize. And this is what you get from reading Desert: is wow, we are fucked. um, at some point in the not too distant future, we're not going to be able to grow food anymore, and that's going to be a real big problem for a lot of people, including me. We're probably going to die. We might starve. It's a very real. It's a very. I know I'm laughing and smiling, but it's a very real possibility, um, because farming techniques are bad right now, and there is, unlike carbon and even non-renewable resources like rare earth metals or whatever, though there is pressure to change, the only tangible, semi-tangible um, public pressure on the agricultural industry in terms of environmental impacts are the fucking vegans who have no idea what they're talking about and aren't addressing the real problem. So we're fucked. Like, you can stop. Most of the time they're like anti-beef people who care a lot about um, atmospheric methane. Uh, they'd care about it for the same reason that people care about car emissions, right? Like, same shit. Uh, Animal agriculture is bad because it produces a lot of carbon emissions. Methane turns into carbon when it's in the atmosphere for a few years. Um, Greenhouse emissions, maybe more generally, but the more fundamental issue is intensive monocrop agriculture that relies on really heavily on fertilizers, exclusively on fertilizers, on otherwise effectively dead land, is just going to stop working at some point, and you're not going to be able to grow food because you've been doing that for too long. You can't just keep farming the same plot of land with the same crop over an entire country or an entire continent for decades and just keep pumping more nitrogen into the soil and just keep pumping more K into the soil. Like, you can't do that. It doesn't work like that. The soil is literally going to turn into sand and dust. Uh, Need I remind you that the Sahara Desert used to be where the Romans grew all their food, but the Romans spent so long growing all their food there that it turned into a fucking desert. Okay, like, that can happen. That happens to big empires with large populations that grow all their food without paying attention to the way they're farming. And here's the fucked up thing is we know how to solve this. We actually have like a really good idea of how to solve this. It's just that no one wants to. There's no pressure to, and it would the thing. It's a lot of these permaculture techniques. I'm saying there's no pressure to do this. There is quite a solid permaculture movement in the world. Okay, it's not as big as it should be, and a lot of them are like hippies who don't really know why they're doing anything. Um, but this permaculture is a something that's been studied reasonably extensively. Like, we know how to various alternative farming techniques to replace um, regenerative farming techniques to replace artificial fertilizers. We know which plants to grow together to regenerate the soil. We've known this for a long time now. These techniques aren't crazy. People know how to do it. They just won't. And as I said, what's crazier is a lot of these permaculture techniques have been proven to be more productive than monocrop agriculture, um, and yet they don't do it. And there's a couple of reasons why, but the number one reason why is, in my opinion, legibility. That, like, it's much harder to keep track of what you're growing and how much of it and who owns what when you're sort of growing a bunch of different shit all together, uh, widely distributed rather than big giant fields of corn exclusively. Uh, and that's the main pressure against permaculture and intercropping and agroforestry and all of the cool things. It's a shame that we're all gonna die like that. It's a damn shame, but what can you do? Nothing really. Yeah, that's something that's kind of intention with everything else, is that I think people aren't concerned enough about soil degradation in the world. I think basically no one is as concerned as me. Uh, Only like nerds, and even those nerds, I don't know what there needs to the climate people. They really fucked up. They really fucked up by just pushing like one thing, and it's not like they don't all. Increasing temperatures mean hotter sun, which dries out the land and makes it less fertile, right? Like, it all feeds into each other. Um, it's not good. It's not. It's not. We're not. It's not looking good. In terms of the scale from socialism to barbarism, we're really pushing this way. um, yeah, I've been thinking about. Oh, we're doing this now. What's this? This is kind of. I look like a cartoon character when I do this. I feel kind of like Boris Johnson. Am I crazy? Whatever. Uh, I don't know. It's all just fucking nuts, really. But frankly, we'll probably be fine. I'm sure. I'm sure. You know what? Don't worry about it. You're not gonna starve. You'll be fine. And even if we do start starving, then I might finally push people to do a revolution. Uh, and maybe we'll all be better off for it in the long term. And hey, if all the humans do die out, uh, maybe that's okay too. After every mass extinction, there's an explosion of biodiversity. If the Anthropocene causes a mass extinction, uh, and we all die out, whatever comes after us is going to be more biodiverse and more complex than what came before. Let's look at the history of mass extinctions. Every mass extinction, the next group of animals that come along are more biodiverse and more complex. So, maybe we get some cool. We won't be around to see it, but maybe cosmically it'll all be worth it. We're kind of getting away from communism here. um, yeah, I don't know what's going on with me. I don't know. I've just kind of been lost in the sea of pure ideology. I'm just jumping around from topic to topic, trying to match it all together. Like, if you look at my fucking like books that I have on my computer, like I have, what is this? Reading. Where's my books? My library. Yeah. What do I have? I have fucking The Dawn of Everything right next to the Soil and Health Library, One Straw Revolution. That's what that is. And The Art of Not Being Governed, and then shifting cultivation and environmental um, change, which is a book about Sweden agriculture in Southeast Asia, which is what I, after reading The Art of Not Being Governed and being pretty fascinated by the agricultural practices in the region, I downloaded this book, which is just like a very deep, I mean, it's 1,000-page long book about um, Sweden agriculture in uh, Southeast Asia. It's fascinating. It's very dense. Um, I recommend it, honestly. Pretty underrated book. I don't think anyone. This is not a book people would read for fun, generally speaking. Uh, but it is fascinating. And then, you got a book called How Forests Think Towards an Anthropology Beyond the Human, which I thought was kind of bullshit. I read it. There was a Twitter post that I got addicted to Twitter at some point. Like I used to be, I had a passing interest in Twitter. At some point, I got addicted to Twitter. It's not good. Um, but there was a Twitter post that was like just a picture of that book, and it said this book, and it had a bunch of likes and retweets, and I was like, you don't normally see like anthropology books get a bunch of likes and retweets on Twitter. Like maybe there's something worth reading here. Um, but it's interesting. I'm not gonna say it's bullshit or anything, but I think it's just okay. But right, so then you got all that, and then right next to it, I've got Anti-Oedipus, the Thirst for Annihilation, which I was rereading, or not re. I tried to read it once and gave up. Now I know more about Bataille. I'm trying to read it again, and then I've got Lemurian Time War, A Philosophy of Madness by Walter Cousins. Very underrated book. You should read it. It's really good. Um, and some more Deleuze and Guattari stuff, and then The Accursed Share by Georges Bataille, and then randomly uh, a bunch of volumes of Horizon in the Middle of Nowhere, which is not an academic book. That's a fucking light novel. Uh, but what I'm trying to say is, you've got everything. Like if you're reading, the stuff about Sweden agriculture, One Straw Revolution, the art, like this all gives you like a very Stone Age is it's a bad word. It's not a way I should, but almost, you know what? Like you could almost believe I was into solar punk from these books, right? Which I am not. Uh, but then you jump into like all the Nick Land stuff, and then you'd probably think I'm some sort of techno optimist, which I'm also not. So it's like there's I'm like the only person. And it's not entirely true, but it feels like I'm all alone. It feels like I'm all alone, guys. Like there's a lot of people who there are people who like similar things and consider themselves anarchists. Like a great example I would say would be the 100 Rabbits. They're like two people. They live on a boat. They do a bunch of interesting stuff with computers. And when I say interesting stuff with computers, I mean actually good stuff with computers. You should look them up if you don't know about them. Um, really interesting people, artists, um, and programmers. They do a bunch of really cool stuff. They're very concerned with the environment, ecology. Um, they're also anarchists and they're also vegans. Um, and like I like a lot of their stuff. I really like a lot of their stuff. But you know, calling themselves anarchists, like what do they even really mean by that? Like, do they actually have any concrete mode of social organization in mind when they say that? Like, I don't think so. But then the question is, should you? That's real. I think that's really what I'm getting at here. Is like in terms of anarchists with like really concrete plans, you kind of got to look towards like there's basically three brands, as far as I can see, of anarchism, which have actual concrete modes of organization. There's the syndicalists. Um, there's the like democratic and federalists or democratic. Is that what they're called? Communalists. You know those guys. And then there's like the Anprims. Everyone else is a lifestylist. Everyone else is just like fuck the state, bro. And then maybe that's fine. Maybe that's fine. I'm not saying it's necessarily the worst. Because like maybe if you're an anarchist and you're writing some intellectual theory about how you ought to organize society, isn't that kind of bourgeois? Isn't that kind of what you're trying to fight against in the first place? A top-down organization of society? Like, aren't you kind of participating in that? Is this whole project useless? But then, to what degree is the anarchist milieu like a communal exercise? And is it an exercise? And then I didn't mention at the start when I was saying how being an anarchist is like kind of humiliating. Is like Chaz. Like that's one of the most embarrassing things to ever happen ever, right? A political project that actually, like seized territory in the US in big scare quotes because they kind of didn't but occupied some territory in the U.S. At least claimed to. Um, During a period of like heightened political tension, specifically surrounding Black Lives Matter, and then like immediately killed a black person and dissolved. It's like the most textbook failure possible, and I think it's because of this humanist method. Like I think that it's because. But then you get to the sort of opposites. Like who is the biggest critique of this type of politics that I've ever read? I think it's uh, this book, Imagining the Future, by Cernacek and Williams. I don't remember, but that one. And their critique of folk politics, which you know I don't. I go back and forth on how much I agree with this. Like sometimes I think this is their whole thing is evil and stupid, and sometimes I think like it's pragmatic and practical. I don't know. I kind of like this is a book I go back and forth on constantly, where they are mainly analyzing the failure of Occupy and similar movements, and they're saying like these movements failed because of these folk political strategies where they sort of went in without any they didn't have any concrete demands and they saw this as a strength. They like purposefully didn't have any concrete demands, and they had a very horizontal structure without any authority or organization, and then they failed. Like that was kind of and so the book is like proposing well here's what we need to do. We need to uh, like basically I mean, basically the book is read Lenin. that's that's like the actual conclusion the book comes to is the problem with these people is they haven't read Lenin. But really, I mean, the premise of the book is like against prefigurative politics, like the idea that in order to achieve a egalitarian society, it has to be done via egalitarian means, which is something I believe, and it's something that this is like one of the things that I disagree with the book pretty much consistently on, is they really try and critique this idea that like they really don't like the idea of horizontal organization. But then I'm kind of like, well, if you don't like that, why are you a fucking leftist? Like, aren't you just a fascist at that point, or something? Like a capitalist? If you're saying the problem is that these people they aren't able to organize collectively and democratically, we need to get rid of that idea. Then it's like, how can you be in favor of collective democratic ownership of the means of production? What are you talking? Like, it seems kind of insane to me. Um, uh, but then they say like having concrete demands is something I very much agree with. If you're going to do a protest movement or something like that, it's important to have concrete demands, and I think this is something that pretty much every protest and actually well thought through concrete demands, like not just defund the police. Uh, and defund like the reason I'm saying that is because it it was very performative, I guess. Originally the demand was abolish the police, but then it got liberalized into defund the police. Um, the goal of the George Floyd protests, and every um, county in the US that actually defunded the police, like Baltimore, in response to those protests, it was an abject failure. Like it resulted in more people dying. It wasn't good. Like that's not a good goal to. And there's like anyone who's read a book knows why that was a bad idea. Like you can't abolish the police without abolishing capitalism first. Like that's such an obvious thing. I don't even. I'm not even going to explain it. Like why that doesn't work. Or abolishing private property specifically, but these authors they had the concrete goals they have in mind are uh, effectively shorten the workday as much as possible, automate everything that's possible, and give everyone a UBI. And I think those are respectable goals that most people can get behind. Like if there were a large protest movement that was in favor of that, I think it would probably get its mission partially successful. Although I'm also very skeptical of this because it's so reliant on the state. Like I think that the state would take every opportunity to try and sabotage this project, and not because uh, the people in the state are evil, but because that's how the state is organized, right? Like um, state bureaucracy is like specifically a system designed to turn any radical policy into a very neutered form of it. Like someone, and when it and there's this is fairly effective for fighting fascism and fairly terrible for establishing communism. Like it tries to preserve the present state of things. If some fascist comes into the uh, you know state bureaucracy with some uh, extremely far right idea, even if the law gets passed, it normally gets passed in a weakened, neutered form. And the same is the case for leftists. If some leftist comes into parliament with a radical idea, even if the law gets passed, it normally gets weakened and neutered into a version that's shit. And this is really good for people who want to maintain the status quo because everyone can always claim that whatever policy gets passed was a bad idea from the beginning because the version that actually got I mean, I think drug legalization is a great example of this. That like, there are lots of places who have been experimenting with drug decriminalization and legalization, um, and where like a proposed program might be, decriminalize drugs and then use the money that you save from like funding the police to go and arrest drug users, use that take that money away from the police and use it to build community support systems like safe injection sites and uh, rehabilitation services and mental health services and all of those other sorts of things you need to support people when they want to get off drugs or need some sort of help regarding that. But instead, the bill, and this happens extremely reliably, um, instead, once it actually goes through the process of state bureaucracy, that just gets turned into decriminalize drugs and do nothing else. And then it fails, obviously, and you get worse outcomes because you haven't done the important part. And then everyone's like, see, all the drug decriminalization people are lunatics and their ideology failed. Uh, like pretty much every idea that goes, and that's why I'm pretty skeptical of this proposed solution in imagining the future, because I think anything that relies on going through this electoralist, is that the right word? Electoralist? I don't think so. That sort of bureaucratic system is just kind of doomed to fail because that sort of thing will happen. And I'm not convinced. I mean, there's also another maybe bigger reason, which is that um, there are many cases where, like in the modern era, protest movements kind of just don't work. Like, uh, it was kind of like a lot of the relations between the state and the workers uh, were established on sort of good faith uh, in previous generations of organized labor, and then at some point those people died, and then a new generation came, and the state was just sort of like, this is like Reaganomics, Thatcher era stuff, right? Where it's like, if you get mass strikes, the government can just give money to the corporations that are being affected and effectively bail them out of the strikes and just neutralize the. I mean, the government did this very recently in the UK with railway strikes. Rail workers in the UK were striking for a long time for higher pay because they had their real terms wages had gone down consistently by quite a lot. Same with nurses and doctors in the UK were doing the same thing. But the rail is a good example because the government just promised the rail companies that they would reimburse them for any profits they lost due to the strike, which just disables the ability for strikes to work at all because the government is always going to have more money than a union's pool. And I think this is just the sort of thing that happens in neoliberalism now, that like these traditional strategies of leftism um, have have been discovered and uh, co-opted, recuperated, whatever you want to call it, particularly by the state. I think that's a really solid reason why I'm an anarchist, rather than just like some sort of Leninist or something. Which is like you cannot like this is not a problem with neoliberal states. This is a problem with states as an institution. Um, I suppose there's a counter that like I think the best like counter argument to being an anarchist is just basically saying most I think this is particularly a good counter to market anarchists and right libertarians. Like most forms of subjugation happen in the economic realm rather than the political realm. Like the process of development from feudalism to capitalism was the separation of economic power from state power being monopoly on violence, effectively. That like previously there was no distinction between economic power and state power. Like if you're rich, or your relation to the means of production and your relation to the state were the same thing. Aristocrats owned land, and aristocrats were also the government. The when the liberal revolution turned the government democratic and separated the government from the economic sphere, all the power rushed from the now newly democratic government sphere to the still undemocratic economic sphere. And the argument for communism is to democratize the economic sphere. Um, I think it's a pretty compelling. I think it's a pretty compelling argument. Uh, and so like the reason, let's say you have some basic freedom, like freedom of movement, uh, granted by the state. Well, the actual reason you can't go anywhere isn't because the state is telling you can't. It's because you can't afford to go there. You can't afford a car. You can't afford car insurance. You can't afford a train ticket, or there are no train lines that have been built because it's unprofitable. Um, these sorts of things. Well, and this is the case across the board. That, like, generally speaking, you're afforded freedoms by the state, but those freedoms are ineffectual because the economic realm prevents you from actually exercising those freedoms. Uh, which kind of points towards the main concern is the economic realm, not the state realm. But I think that dichotomy is, or that dualism is kind of oversimplistic. Like, if you look at, I feel like this is a pretty typical leftist argument, is to talk about how many people who work for the state used to work for corporations and vice versa. Like, how many oil execs get into positions of governance, and how politicians get paid off by lobbyists and etc. Like, liberals like to talk about this, but I don't think there's, like, I don't know, maybe it's not materialist enough. Maybe that's fair. I think that there's the real. I think that's really why I feel lost, is that um, I'm like the last remaining anarchist who's still a materialist, I guess. Does that make any sense? Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, this video is like an hour long. This is kind of ridiculous.